Hey guys, hope you enjoyed our last unit, World War I. And this unit we're going to begin discussing the 1920s and how they shaped American culture. The one thing we're going to be looking at is this question over here, and that is, what impact did social life in the 1920s have on American culture? So that's something we're going to be taking a look at throughout this unit. But the 1920s really did shape many things in our culture, and it's interesting because at the beginning of the 1920s we went from a time period where things were extravagant to the end of the 1920s where we went through the Great Depression, which was by far the worst economic depression the country's ever seen, and where people faced some really hard times. So that's why I have this titled From Bang to Bust. So a couple things you might think about in the 1920s. First off, we have this picture here of all these new cars. This is a time frame when owning a car would become a little bit more popular, and it will be a little bit more accessible. And you can see they're very luxurious. These cars here specifically are convertibles, so that was a new thing. These cars are beginning to go really fast as well. You can see a couple things. They have different types of cars, like you can see Mercedes-Benz is there, and Ford is over here. So this is the time frame, the 1920s. It's kind of the idea of like luxury, and people should be able to own things. There's some other things going on too. So first we have the, sorry guys. First we have, so there's a couple other things going on as well. First thing we have is the development of the speakeasy. This is the time when Prohibition was in effect, and so people would gather at little tiny clubs that you could only get into with a secret password, and they would have their drink then. And in these clubs, people would dress up to the nines. It was kind of like they were going to have a party. So to some degree, if you were going to a social event at someone's house today where you had a party, speakeasy was part of that. Along with the speakeasy would be the development of certain types of music, like the jazz age. So jazz would lead to numerous types of music, like rock and roll and hip hop. This would develop during the 1920s. Also would come into play would be the advent of movies. This is the time frame when Hollywood would really start to bubble up, and things like the Oscars would begin to develop. So if you think of anything glamorous with Hollywood, you can thank the 1920s with that. So we'll see how that happened. And then also fashion started to take a role. So this is an example of a flapper. We'll talk about what that is. But women started to begin showing their legs a little bit more, and people began designing clothes that were fashionable. That had always taken place, but some of the things that would occur would influence our fashion today. So this is what's going on during the 1920s, and we'll again ask ourselves, how did this shape American culture? In a sense, after the early 20th century, for the first 2 decades, there was a desire to return to normalcy. I want to read you a quote that President Harding made. And this was something he gave a speech in 1920 to a cheering crowd in Boston, and he said that America's present need is not heroics but healing, not nostrums, which refers to a calamity or disaster or chaos. He says, not nostrums but normalcy, not revolution but restoration, not surgery but serenity. And Americans like this idea. But we have to ask ourselves, what is normalcy? If you were to look it up in the dictionary at the time, you wouldn't find it. It was actually a word that he made up. So he's not the first one to do it. It won't be the last. But we have to think ourselves, how could America return to normalcy? We just had the Great War, World War I. We just had that where 50,000 soldiers died and millions more were drafted, and they were coming home to new jobs. Women now had, first off, could vote. So We had women's rights to some degree with voting. We just had the progressive era where workers' rights were happening as well. And not only that, but we also had prohibition, as I said. Prohibition was going into effect. So, how could we return to normalcy? Oh, and one more thing. We also had the avian bird flu, which killed off just as many people as World War One. So, how could America return to normalcy in this? And what do you think Harding's referring to when he says that we want to return to normalcy? Well, we're going to think about that today. For your assignment, I want you to think of some of the aspects of the 1920s I talked about very briefly. Could have been things like Hollywood, music, fashion, luxury, cars, having a good time at a speakeasy. What do you think Harding was referring to when he says normalcy? And with that in mind, what do you think he would say if, just based off this quote, you don't obviously have to know Harding or anything he would say, this is just simply going off this quote, what do you think he would say if someone wanted to talk about issues of race, or they wanted to talk about women's roles in society, or they wanted to talk about scientific advancement, or they wanted to talk about engineering or building cities or infrastructure? What do you think he would say about that with this idea of normalcy? So, two questions you have to answer. What do you think he's referring to when he says normalcy? And what do you think he would say in response if someone wanted to talk about some of these issues? So you can answer that question below. And then that will wrap up today's introduction. Looking forward to studying this unit with you. Let me know if you have any questions.